It's a battle of the vice presidential PBS programming here on Boston Public Radio. Joined now by two award-winning GBH filmmakers about two brand new documentaries highlighting the role of vice presidents, past, present, and future. Cameo George is executive producer for American Experience, on to talk about their latest film, which examines the office of vice presidents throughout history. And as I said to you when I met you, I learned a lot, and I know Marjorie did too. It's terrific. And Raney Aronson-Rath is editor-in-chief and executive producer of Frontline on their new documentary, The VP Choice, about the life and political careers of candidates J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. And we should mention that not too long ago, Raney and her colleagues won the Academy Award for Best Documentary, 20 Days of Mariupol. And as we're talking about that, one of the great films ever, we're looking at young Raney, Covet reporter, as we call him, for the Daily Cardinal at the University of Wisconsin in 1990, Raney. That's pretty incredible.
Thank you for finding that. Frontline. I had to say, 1990s hair. It was a moment.
It is 90s hair. You're right. Frontline's film will premiere on October 8th at 10 p.m. on GBH2 and Frontline YouTube channel. American Experiences, The American Vice President, premieres on October 1st at 8 p.m. on GBH2 and on the American Experience YouTube channel. And by the way, if you didn't get enough programming notes here, Frontline's The Choice 2024 Harris versus Trump, which we discussed with Michael Kirk last week, that is spectacular. He's the guy who made it. Premieres tonight at 9 p.m. on GBH2 and the Frontline YouTube channel. Segment's also almost over, so nice to see you both. Cameo and Raney, congratulations.
Nice to see you too.
So, Raney, let's start with you. How did this come about that you were getting ready with Frontline with the Veeps, and Cameo, you were already doing the Veeps, like the Veeps down through history? How did this come about?
I mean, I'll speak for Frontline, but we thought this particular season that we should look at the VP candidates, and Cameo can tell us the history, but for us, at the time, we were looking at Biden and Trump, and people started to ask questions about who were the people sitting next to them. And so we did commission a film. It was originally about Kamala Harris and whoever was going to be Trump's candidate with him. And then, of course, everything changed, as we all know, and we had to do a very intense pivot in the middle of the summer, and now we're working hard on the VP candidate show for Frontline, which airs on October 8th.
So, Raney, before we leave you, but you and your predecessors have been doing The Choice since 1988.
Yes.
Why this year, the VPs? Is it because how old the two candidates were? Obviously 78 and 81.
Here's
when
the
Biden
thing.
was in the race.
I started to feel this way actually when Pence was the vice president as
Really?
well. I started to wonder what was his ideology, what did he think about, what was he talking to Trump about during those years, and so I got really curious about that role as a VP. Then in this case, we thought, right, both of these men who are going to be running against each other, they have candidates next to them. We should know who's next in line. And so that's really the birth of this, as an idea. First time we're doing it, so it's been an experiment, but I think it's a vital one, and Cameo will tell you why. I mean, they really play an important role in our history.
Well, that was one of the things that I learned, is that they really do play an important part, because I think 1 in 5 vice presidents wind up being presidents.
It's incredible.
I had no idea.
Nor did I.
But they didn't get much respect for a long time, so fill us in on that.
Right. So for us, it's really interesting because we did start out thinking about making this film because of the age of the candidates, when it was Biden versus Trump. But then as we started thinking about the implications of that and some of the statistical data that shows how often a vice president does have to step up in the case of infirmity of the president or all sorts of different conditions, we realized we really do, as a country, treat the vice presidency as a joke, as a punchline. And we thought, this, of all years, we should not do that. And we have to know who the people are who are standing next to the person at the top of the ticket.
Who said in your film, "Consolation Prize without consolation"? That was a great line. Who was that?
That was Lyndon B. Johnson.
It was?
That was Lyndon
But
that's
my
great.
favorite line is the line you started with the woman who had 2 sons who disappeared. Fill in the blanks there. I thought that was a great line.
The lore is this woman who talked about these 2 sons who were lost to her forever. One was lost at sea, never to be heard from again. One was lost at sea, the other became vice president. But
I love that.
Right?
I love that one. Yeah.
And by the way, we should go, I assume most people at least know this fact. It's probably the only thing in the film that I knew beforehand. The vice president under the Constitution has virtually no responsibilities. He or she, in this particular case, They preside over the Senate so that if there's a tie vote, they break the ties. Harris has done, Vice President Harris, many a time. And they succeed or fill in for the president once the 25th Amendment came about, but succeed the president if he, based on our history, dies.
But
that's it, right?
That is it. But the thing that's so incredible is that you brought up the 25th Amendment, which is the crux of what our film revolves around. That didn't come into play until JFK was assassinated.
Yeah.
And so to think that we've had the Constitution for 200 years and no one had thought about rules of succession until the 60s, like that's actually pretty incredible.
Can we start, one of the things that is, there's so many factoids in this that are incredible. How little, forget formal responsibility, how little respect so many vice presidents had. I hope I got this number right because I was falling asleep at this point. Not because of the film, it was late at night. Did you say that when, we're going to get to Rockefeller in a few minutes, when Spiro Agnew had to resign, and obviously ultimately, there was the disappearance of Richard Nixon too, but before that, it was Rockefeller, that the budget of the vice president's office when Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president was $48,000. Is that the right number?
I'll have to double check the number,
But a
but
really
it was
low number.
astonishingly low. And it wasn't until Walter Mondale actually came in that the office became something more akin to what we're used to seeing now, where there's actually an office that is in the West Wing, that there is a budget, that there's staff, and that there's actually an expectation that the president will take on serious policy issues and a more robust and firm role.
That's the voice of Cameo George. She's an executive producer for American Experience. Their film on the vice presidency airs on October 1st at 8 p.m. With her is Raney Aronson-Rath, who runs Frontline. You allowed to say runs Frontline?
Sure.
Okay,
She runs it.
Frontline.
That's right.
And October 8th, the VP choice will also be on GBH2.
So, Raney, tell us what you have found out, at least so far, that we might not know about Tim Walz or J.D. Vance.
I think the most important thing that we're doing in the film is we're looking at how they form their political ideologies, the way they think politically. So as opposed to telling their entire biography, we're really looking at where did they get their ideas from. In each case, their childhoods and their education and their life experience actually really shaped them. So what you're going to hear from are friends, family, people who know them well, and that's a really fresh take on these two people who oftentimes you're just seeing quick sound bites from, you're seeing them interpreted by other media. This way you can actually understand, okay, what is the trajectory of their life? How did they arrive at these points of view? And then what would that mean for all of us if they're sitting next to the president?
Well, one of the things after reading Vance's book a while ago, Hillbilly Elegy, which turned out to be nothing like I expected, I thought he was going to talk about how poor people get abused and neglected and all that kind of stuff. And he seemed to have such a disturbing childhood. I can't help think that unless he's gone through intensive therapy, and I don't know if he has, that he's a disturbed person as a grown-up. I mean, the mother threatened to kill him. The mother,
It's a good question for Raney.
The grandmother's got all these guns everywhere. I mean, didn't she try to set her husband on fire at one point or
I
something?
think the thing to remember about JD, regardless of his upbringing, and I think everyone could say this too, is that he does go to Yale.
Right.
He is very influenced by Peter Thiel and others who are in his circle as he goes forward in both his work that he does in Silicon Valley and then later his work that he does as a politician himself. And I think if you look at him as a character, as a person, yes, he had that childhood, he's owned it, he's talked about it, but then he really does do a pivot to think about like what does matter to him and what he believes is best. And so it's really important to look at J.D. Vance today, even though the book was about his childhood and his upbringing.
You don't think a lot of his weird views of today have to do with his weird upbringing? I don't know.
No comment, right?
Okay, no comment.
Right.
Okay.
And just important to note that when we're doing political reporting, there is a variety of different points of view out there about each of these candidates. And so sometimes when someone's speaking, J.D. Vance, you could take him for example, he's speaking and some people will resonate with what he believes in. And those are the things that we wrestle with in the film. Our job really as reporters is to put it out on the table. And then you decide, do you want to vote for a candidacy that has Trump and J.D. Vance, or do you want to vote for Harris, in the case of the choice, obviously, as well, and of course, her running mate, who's Tim Walz.
How about him? Anything we
So
don't...
Tim is a very interesting character. I mean, the fact is, one of his gifts is communication, and we've really looked at him being a social studies teacher and his ability to talk to pretty much anyone across a partisan divide. We spent a lot of time in the film looking at his work that he did in his congressional district that was mostly conservative, and how he tried to bridge the gaps there, especially with issues like Obamacare and other things like that. And that's a big part of his story that hasn't really been told. And I think it's really, really quite interesting to learn.
You know what I tell you I love that you just did? That you called them JD and Tim. I'm so sick of Harris being called Kamala by everybody in the media, or Kamala in the case of Trump, and referring to them by their last names. That really made me happy. Can we talk about your thing for a second? I hope I get the chronology right, because I had forgotten this. So Richard Nixon begins to get in trouble.
Yes.
And then after he begins to get in trouble, feel free to correct me, Spiro Agnew, former governor of Maryland, who is his vice president, starts to get in trouble. Is that right or no?
It's actually Spiro Agnew, since we're doing
Whatever,
first
yeah.
names. He starts to get in trouble. And
Even before?
Even before the news of Watergate begins to break. And one of the things that we talk about in the film that's so interesting in terms of the chronology is that the Attorney General is trying to get in touch with President Nixon, and they're
Is
like,
this Elliot Richardson at the time? Which attorney? Elliot Richardson.
yes,
Okay.
they need to talk,
Yeah.
but they won't leave a message and explain why. And it turns out that it's because they've started to collect evidence about what's happening with Spiro Agnew.
Okay, so far I've gotten one thing wrong. Let me go to the next thing, see if I can get this wrong too. But then it becomes clear, since Nixon's in trouble, that they got to figure out how to get Agnew the hell out of there as quickly as possible, because otherwise, if Nixon does disappear, either impeached and convicted or resign, and there's a guy under criminal investigation in his home state of Maryland, there's a problem. So ultimately, a plea deal is cut. He doesn't go to jail. Agnew is gone. And then all of a sudden, we have who is the vice president of the United States?
We have Gerald Ford from the 5th District of Michigan, a man who, by all accounts, had no interest in running for the presidency. He had no interest in being vice president. In fact, he had told his wife and his family members that he was actually thinking about stepping down and not running for re-election in his own congressional district when he gets the call.
So he becomes president, and he realizes he's got to pick somebody to fill the hole. Here's that moment. Here's a clip from your film on American Experience, talking about the choice Ford made for VP, followed by archival tape of the announcement. Here it is.
Adding even more to the whole oddness of the situation, if you will, was that the first task Gerald Ford had as president was to choose a new vice president.
So he comes through the door now with his choice, and the choice, it is Nelson Rockefeller, the former governor of New York, who was leading the list of speculation among many people.
Yeah, and based on that sound, I didn't remember either. We didn't even know who the choice was till Rockefeller, the former governor of New York, walked through the door?
Until he walked through the door, everyone was peering, waiting to see who was going to walk through. So it really was, unlike now where there's speculation, there's the whole Veep stakes, who's it going to be? You're talking about the pros and cons of each of the potential candidates. This was a blank slate, and no one knew.
I figured it was a good move because he was so rich he wouldn't have to be doing any shenanigans on the side to make money, and Nelson Rockefeller came from a very wealthy family, as we recall.
He did. And there's one last thing, and then I'll shut up about this, that I thought was fabulously interesting. The Speaker of the House, who's next in line for the presidency, is Carl Albert.
Yes.
Now, he faces a couple of issues coming before him and a potential consequence based upon what he does. Explain what that was there, Cameo.
Carl Albert is an amazing figure in history who I really knew nothing about before the making of this film. We're in a situation, as you just set up, Richard Nixon has to step aside. His vice president has already had to step aside. So now there are two potential vacancies that are about to happen. Carl Albert, as Speaker of the House, is next in line. He is a Democrat. But Nixon, who had just won in a landslide, is a Republican. And so Carl Albert is presented with this moment where he can, as some of our experts talked about, stage a revolution and take over and instate himself as a Democrat.
Proceeds
as
with
the president.
impeachment and doesn't proceed with the confirmation of the vice president.
Could have
and
been
he
him.
becomes president of the United States.
We could have had President Carl Albert, but it's
incredible.
It's that period in history is absolutely unbelievable, amazing. We had a president and a vice president, neither of whom had run for election, had never received a single vote from the American public.
You know, Raney, I know you're doing.
That's incredible.
It is incredible.
It's just history we should all know, right? I just love it.
Yeah, I didn't know any of this stuff. I
How
didn't
many
know
of the
Garfield.
51 vice presidents can any of the three of you name?
Oh, come on, Jim.
None of them, practically.
Oh, we could do all of them, and then we'll go off the air.
I'll tell you, I knew almost none.
But I also learned that Garfield, after he got shot, lingered for 88 days. I mean, that was incredible. I did not realize that either. You know what? One of the great scenes, though, I thought in your documentary, was the scene when Eisenhower is coming back home after recovering, I think, from his second heart attack. The crowds, the adulation, people cheering, the big welcome back Ike signs. I thought that was kind of sad because you would probably never see that
I had this
anymore.
discussion last night
You
that
did?
the candidates, their images, everything around them is so tightly managed, regardless of party, just where we are now in contemporary politics, you would never see that kind of moment of vulnerability. It's literally Ike in a wheelchair with a blanket over his lap, and he looks frail, he looks small, and we just would not have that experience today, I don't think.
I don't think so. I don't think so either. So, you know, I know you're doing biographies and not political analysis, Raney, but what's your sense from the reporting? Do people think this matters, that who the vice president is in terms of what happens with the
I
election?
do this time around. I feel like actually in the VP film, we do more political analysis than we did in The Choice. And the reason we did it is because so much is not known about what they both believe. So we really felt it was imperative to understand, especially in the final act, what does Tim Walz believe in? What has his voting record been? The same thing with J.D. Vance. Shorter voting record, obviously, right? But we're looking at it through the lens of what do they believe in? How are their political ideologies formed? And I do think people are incredibly curious about both these candidates. I think it has to do with the fury of the race, right? It is a neck-and-neck race. People are looking for what differentiates them, and they're looking at Tim and JD as very different people, right? They have very different ideas, represent different parts of this sort of American dream even, if you think about it. So I think that's what we really focus on. So you do see more politics in this film than you would have in The Choice.
But by the way, for people who don't see The Choice, I should just say, one of
The
the
Choice is great.
beyond how spectacular they are, is proof to me at least how fair you and your people are. Everybody talks to you. It doesn't matter
It's
who
true.
virtually everybody sits down for an interview, which speaks to the fact that they think they'll get a fair deal, which is
Right.
hugely
No, I
important.
mean, that's huge, right? And that's the same thing with J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, is
sure.
we have people from both sides of that aisle talking to us, family, friends, political analysts, people who have looked at their lives in a more critical way, people who look at them and agree with them. And I think that's really important because that is America.
I know he announced very proudly that his mother had been 10 years sober at the Republican National Convention. Did you talk to the mom?
We didn't get to the mother.
Yeah, she wouldn't do it. Oh, well.
Maybe you can. Maybe you guys do know.
Cameo, could you explain the 25th Amendment, which almost none of us heard of until Donald Trump was president, and there was some talk, unconfirmed, that cabinet members were talking about using Section 4, which no one really ever heard of, titled Declaration by the Vice President and Cabinet Members of a President's Inability to Serve. Forget that for a second. The other, Birchby, senator from Indiana, is that right? I think he was. How did the 25th Amendment come about to begin with?
So as I was talking about before, there was this moment when the country is deeply grief-stricken in the wake of JFK being assassinated live on television. And where we are politically as a country, there's the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are all of these things, remnants of the Cold War. The state of international relations is tense. America's role in the world is critical. And so when JFK is killed, suddenly, for the first time in more than 100 years, people actually come to grips with the fact that there is no actual documented rule of succession for what needs to happen.
That's incredible.
And so, as you're saying, Senator Bai and others are just like, we can't let this happen. And so there is a process where Congress people, led by him and others, academic experts, attorneys, come together and try to figure out, how do we map this out? Like, what should the rules be? Because all along it's been sort of a gentleman's agreement. We talked about Eisenhower when he's in the hospital. He and Richard Nixon basically have a handshake agreement that if something goes south with him, then Richard Nixon will step up. But people realize there are just so many things happening in the country of such major import that we can't just leave it up to a handshake agreement. And so the process for formulating an amendment begins.
You know, Raney, obviously we're here to talk about what you're doing in the Vice Presidents, but for people who haven't seen it, since it did win the Academy Award and it was one of the most incredible pieces of journalism I've seen in quite some time, give people an idea of what 20 Days of Mariupol was about and how it came about.
Oh, thank you for asking, and thank you. So 20 Days in Mariupol was a film really told by journalists who were under siege in Mariupol with other people who were Ukrainian during the first 20 days of the war. And they were under siege. Obviously, Russians were coming in, and they stayed and they filmed. There was a point in which they could have left. They decided not to leave and stay. Then they wanted to leave, and they couldn't get out. So it's a really tense 20 days, and they filmed literally everything. These are news AP reporters, they're journalists, they're not filmmakers. But what I think happened is, because they had cameras and video cameras, they were able to essentially just cover it as if it was a documentary. We got involved because the AP came to us and told us, you know, what you're seeing in the news isn't the whole story. Would you like to look at the extended rushes, which are just really the footage? And we did. And within about 2 days said to them, we see a very important story to be told in documentary form. And then we spent a few months working with the AP reporter, especially Mstislav Cherenov, and created a film that was really remarkable and memorable. Michelle Meisner, who's with GBH and Frontline, edited it, and we worked on it in Boston, right here.
And I remember the scene at the beginning of the war that we all saw that was so upsetting about the maternity ward that was bombed.
That's what got our attention too.
Yeah.
You know, the maternity ward that was bombed, they were there when it was happening. They were able to profile the women who were affected, the children, the doctors. And so that's a really potent scene. Also, a lot of the people on the ground thought that that would really get international attention, and it didn't really, right? We all noticed it, but then the sort of trajectory of the war didn't change as much as they had hoped. Very personal story told by Mstislav himself, very on the ground. And then, of course, you see them escape. And that's one of the most dramatic scenes that I've ever seen filmed, where they're escaping with the Red Cross and others as they're trying to leave Mariupol, and they got out safely. And incidentally, right before them, another filmmaker had tried to leave, and he was killed. So it's really a potent and really important, ongoing, important story. We're working with them again.
Oh, good. Oh,
Yes.
great. They need help.
Well, and Joe Biden's just this morning making a plea at the UN for the people of Ukraine and support for their country. Can we spend one last minute or two talking about the vice presidency stuff? You know, do you both think when you're home, not, well, even at work, we talked about civic education and polarization the other day, and the polarization is just, as we all know, out of control, bad for democracy, bad for your mental health, bad for everything. And we posited, not an original notion, a lot of people have said it, is when you learn more about your government, learn how the system works, how it doesn't work, it maybe mutes some of the edges of that. Do you subscribe to that notion, Cameo? Because this really is a lesson. As I said, we learned, I'd say 90% of what we saw in this film we had no idea was the state of the law or the Constitution. Do you subscribe to that?
I absolutely do, and I think that that's at the heart of our mission at American Experience, not just with this film, but all of the films that we do. There's so much about our government, about our country, that we just don't know. Highly educated people where things, you gloss over them, and I think that if you have a deeper understanding and you have more context based in history and government and civics, that you will have a better understanding of where we are today, of the politics that we're dealing with today. And, you know, a point that our filmmaker, Michelle Ferrari, made, actually, is that one of the things that struck her the most in making this film was a reminder that government can change, and these founding documents can change. That's the whole idea of amendments. And we think that we are, quote unquote, stuck with so many things, but actually you just need a chorus of people who have the motivation to do something and then the stick-to-itiveness to actually carry it through. And that's the thing. Like, there's a reason that we have amendments. Like, none of these documents are perfect.
How about you, Raney?
So it's interesting as Cameo is talking, and I don't want to speak for you at all, but I think a lot of us who are in public media are here because of the educational mandate of our programming. So our programs, Frontline, and many of our programs actually are seen in over 60% of the public educational schools across America.
I didn't know that.
And that
Wow.
is actually something that is for all of us deeply meaningful, that our work, our journalism is reaching younger people. And we're also, and I'll come hopefully and talk with you all about it, launching something called Frontline Short Docs, where we're making short documentaries. We're doing it this election season for younger people, especially people who are voting for the first time. They can go there and they can see shorter form documentaries.
On what kinds of things?
On the choice, to American families, and hopefully, if we can get it done, the VPs as well.
That's fabulous. That is really
I mean, they're
fabulous.
short. They're 5 or 6 minutes each, but we hope that that will encourage younger people to know their history, know who's they're voting for, understand more, without all the partisan noise and the sort of commercialized media around them.
Please
See
do
the
come
quote?
back. Yeah.
See the
Yeah.
quote from Zoe?
What's
Our
that?
producer says, "That's how I got here. Nova Frontline films in high school were a big reason
my
I
God.
studied journalism in college." So there
Right,
you go.
Me too. I
There
mean,
you
that's
go.
how I learned about Frontline, was in a high school class.
Really?
So this is how, we didn't have a television at home.
Oh.
So this is literally an access point for many of us, and an ongoing, and maybe more important than ever, part of why our work has the reach that it has.
You know, one last thing before you go. I hadn't thought of this until you were both speaking about commitment to one's country and government and the peaceful transfer of power and whatever. One of the things from your film, Cameo, that we have all seen is the incredible picture when Lyndon Johnson is being sworn in on the plane. And what struck me, even though I've seen the photograph 5,000 times, is while his wife is standing to his right, as you'd expect, standing to his left is a woman who just experienced maybe the worst trauma that any human being can experience in her life, the wife of the executed president. And I assume, I mean, I haven't read as much about it as I should, it's because she knew what that moment meant to the country, despite what she had just suffered, no?
Right. They all knew. She knew that she had to be there and that was part of the compact that she made with the American public. Lyndon Johnson knew that he had to be there, and despite his own grief as well, had to stand strong, had to say, I'm willing to step into this role, and that with the quote, the famous quote, with your help and with God's, that I will be able to carry out this duty. And so there really was a sense throughout, regardless of your political affiliation, that, we're doing this for a greater reason and a greater
Yeah.
good.
Comes through.
And just reminded me in terms of Jacqueline Kennedy being able to see the importance of these kinds of things. You showed her getting off the airplane, still in the pink suit,
Still with blood.
covered with blood, because she wanted people to see the blood on her clothing. Oh, God.
Can I say one last thing here? I hope this doesn't offend you, because the entertainment word in public media is sometimes anathema. Not only do we learn a huge amount from both of what you do, your films are really, many of the films, obviously some are so intense, but are entertaining too. And that is huge, because it, as you know better, that it keeps people's attention when they might wander. And
I
you-
don't think that's
you
offensive
both do it
at
brilliant.
We're
all.
I'm glad.
storytellers,
Well,
right?
that's exactly right.
I mean, we're journalists, but we're storytellers. We love a good story, right? And actually, when we're making decisions at Frontline, it is also story. You're looking for, and we were talking about this last night with JD Vance and Tim Walz in our rough cut session. What are the stories that
Yeah.
you will never forget that are emblematic of who they are and their political views?
Well, there's a woman
so
who agrees
it's
with
always
you.
in a story.
Standing right where you are, Doris Kearns Goodwin was there last week and said it's all about stories.
It's all-
That's
and
the
it
only
always
thing you
has
remember.
been.
It's the only thing you
Right.
act upon.
It was ever
and she's
thus.
totally right, as are you. Congratulations to both of you.
Thank
Films
you
are great.
very
Thanks
much
so much.
for
Really appreciate
being
it.
here.